Chciałbym teraz poprosić pana komandora Pawła Podgórnego o dokonanie laudacji dla naszego przyjaciela i członka Instytutu oraz członka Stowarzyszenia Rodzin Katyńskich w Ottawie, pana Andrew Kavchaka. Bardzo proszę.
Będę lepiej widoczny. Szanowny Panie Ambasadorze, Pani Konsul, Szanowni Zebrani. Nie jest przypadkiem, że w dniu dzisiejszym spotykamy się również oprócz upamiętnienia naszych ofiar z katastrofy i tragedii katyńskiej, katastrofy smoleńskiej, ale spotykamy się też po to, aby uhonorować osoby, w tym dniu dzisiejszym osobę, która wniosła olbrzymi wkład w upamiętnienie tych historycznych, tragicznych wydarzeń. Chciałbym poinformować, że z inicjatywy prezesa Instytutu Haleckiego, pana doktora Aleksandra Jabłońskiego, Ataszat wystosował wniosek do ministra obrony narodowej o odznaczenie pana Andrew Kavchaka odznaczeniem resortowym za działalność, jaką przez ostatnie lata prowadził, w zasadzie przez całe swoje życie, ale owoc tej pracy to zbierany jest w zasadzie w ostatnich latach. Przełożył się na to, że pamięć o Katyniu nie tylko jest obecna w Polsce, ale również tutaj w Ameryce Północnej. Pozwólcie Państwo, że przedstawię sylwetkę pana Andrew Kavchaka. Pan Andrew Kavchak jest synem profesora doktora Andrzeja Kavchaka, profesora filozofii Concordia University oraz wnukiem zamordowanego podczas zbrodni katyńskiej w Charkowie majora Stanisława Kavchaka, który w 1918 roku służył m.in. w 20. Pułku Piechoty i 1. Pułku Strzelców Podhalańskich. Również uczestniczył w tym czasie w wyzwoleniu Nowego Sącza, a przed samą II wojną światową m.in. pełnił funkcję sędziego sądu wojskowego. Pan Andrew Kavchak jest członkiem Instytutu Naukowego imieniem Oskara Haleckiego w Ottawie. W ramach Instytutu prowadzi aktywną działalność naukową, prowadząc badania w obszarze historii Wojska Polskiego. Poprzez niezliczoną liczbę wykładów wygłoszonych w trakcie sympozjów i seminariów organizowanych przez kanadyjskie i amerykańskie uczelnie oraz ośrodki naukowe, m.in. Waszyngtoński Institute of World Politics, a także poprzez swoją działalność publikacyjną przybliża północnoamerykańskim historykom działalność Wojska Polskiego. Szczególnym obszarem prowadzonych przez niego badań była geneza i skutki zbrodni katyńskiej. W 2020 roku, po wielu latach badań, wydał pierwszą opracowaną w języku angielskim zbiorczą bibliografię publikacji traktujących o zbrodni katyńskiej. The Katyn Massacre, an annotated bibliography of books in English, co przyczyniło się znacząco do podniesienia wiedzy i świadomości historycznej kanadyjskich i amerykańskich naukowców o znaczeniu zbrodni katyńskiej dla historii Wojska Polskiego. Ta unikatowa publikacja zawiera omówienie najważniejszych wydawnictw, jakie w ciągu ostatnich 70 lat ukazały się na ten temat, w tym także pierwsze tłumaczenia książek generała Władysława Andersa. Pan Andrew Kavchak jest także autorem wydanego w 2019 roku angielskiego tłumaczenia książki Milknące echa. Wspomnienia z wojny 1914-1920. A poza publikacjami bezpośrednio nawiązującymi do historii Wojska Polskiego jest również autorem książek i opracowań dotyczących Holokaustu, a także historii najnowszej, m.in. rosyjskich działań szpiegowskich w Kanadzie w okresie zimnej wojny. Szanowni Państwo, w uznaniu zasług i dotychczasowej działalności świadczącej o aktywnym wspieraniu na arenie międzynarodowej, pokojowej działalności Wojska Polskiego, a także działalności przyczyniającej się do popularyzacji dziejów i tradycji Wojska Polskiego, minister obrony narodowej decyzją nr 65 98 łamane przez DK o nadaniu medalu Wojska Polskiego nadał panu Andrew Kavchak złoty medal Wojska Polskiego. Proszę pana Andrew Kavchak o wystąpienie, a pana ambasadora o odznaczenie zasłużonej osoby.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, Madam Consul, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. This is a real honor, and I thank you very, very much. My only regret is that my parents passed away a few years ago, and I know my parents would be tremendously proud. Fortunately, my mother's younger sister, Ciocia Eva, still lives in Warszawa. She just turned 90, and when I spoke with her a couple of weeks ago and told her about this ceremony, she was so happy, and she insisted that I send her pictures as soon as possible. So all of you who are taking pictures, please send them to me. I was told that I have a maximum of 20 minutes. Anybody who knows me knows that's difficult for me, but I'll try my best. If my grandfather, Stanisław Kavchak, had lived to the year in which I was born, he would have been 70 years old. And if he would have lived just a few more years, I might have had some memories of him telling me about his life and about Polish history. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. In September of '39, he was captured by the Soviets, taken to Starobielsk, murdered in Kharkiv in the spring of 1940, in what became known as the Katyn Forest Massacre. I think of all the elements of the history and story of Katyn, the two things that really stick out for all of us, I think, is the sheer monstrosity of the crime first. It takes a truly depraved mind, criminal mind, to think of conceive of a plan to murder 20,000 people and dispose of their bodies in such a way as to remove any trace of them ever having existed. And the second thing, of course, is the 50 years of deception, lies, and cover-up. And I think those two things say a lot about the inhabitants of the Kremlin, both before the war and during the war, and even today, as we witness this incessant attempt to destroy Ukraine. Now, for people of Polish origin and from the nationalities along the borders of Russia, the Katyn story really isn't surprising. It's eerily familiar. But for many people in the West, it's bewildering. And there's a certain naivete there. And I'd like to tell you, the naivete in the highest government circles in government in Ottawa existed in World War II. and existed many decades later. And I'd like to illustrate the point by referring to the Gouzenko defection of 1945 and my efforts to commemorate his bravery at the turn of the century. Igor Gouzenko was a young GRU officer, Soviet military intelligence. And in 1943, he was sent to the newly opened Soviet embassy here in Ottawa. He was followed by his wife Svetlana, and because there wasn't enough space in the Soviet compound to house the families and the staff, Igor and Svetlana Gouzenko lived in apartment 4 on the second floor at 511 Somerset Street, between Bay and Lion, right across from Dundonald Park in downtown Ottawa. And during the course of his work at the embassy, Igor Gouzenko was a cipher clerk who coded and decoded messages to and from the center in Moscow. In the process, he discovered that there was a Soviet spy ring that had penetrated the Canadian government and the Manhattan Project. Now, at the end of the war, he and his wife had a 2-year-old son, and Svetlana was pregnant. And when the atomic bombs exploded in Japan, they thought it wise to notify the West that Stalin was getting the atomic secrets. On the 2nd of September 1945, the Japanese surrendered, and World War II formally came to an end. And just 3 days later, in what I believe can be characterized as the very first significant international incident of the Cold War, Igor Gouzenko walked out of the Soviet embassy in Sandy Hill with 109 documents stuffed under his shirt, exposing documents about the Soviet espionage. And his objective was to go to the media, because if they publicized it, and the NKVD subsequently managed to assassinate him, at least the public would know. So he went to the offices of the Ottawa Journal. And even though the reporters and the editors literally had the scoop of the century in the palms of their hands, they refused to listen to him and take his information, because they said that nobody here wanted to say anything except nice things about Stalin. So he went to the offices of the Justice Minister Louis Sénéral, and he was told to wait. And he waited for hours before he was told the minister would not see him. Now, in the meantime, Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister, had been informed that there was somebody from the Soviet embassy who wanted to divulge some information about Soviet espionage. Now, Mackenzie King was a strange man. When he died in 1950, he had been Prime Minister longer in Canada than any other Prime Minister in any other country in the history of the entire British Commonwealth. So he must have had some pretty good political instincts and judgment. But in this case, he failed big time, because when he was told about Gouzenko wanting to defect, he said, "Oh no, we can't have that. We have to send him back to the Soviet embassy, because this would damage our relations with Stalin." Unfortunately, cooler heads prevailed. Gouzenko was taken in after a few days, given RCMP protection. An investigation was carried out. 20 spies were arrested. 11 were convicted, including an MP in the House of Commons, and Dr. Alan Nunn May, the very first of the atom bomb spies to be caught. In 1946, a royal commission investigating Gouzenko's revelations concluded that by what he had done, Canada was in his debt, which it most certainly was. And decades later, 54 years later, in 1999, I visited Dundonald Park. I wanted to see that building where he lived. second floor, a little round window, apartment 4, and I looked around. There was no monument, no plaque, no marker, no statue, nothing to show that once upon a time there was an extremely courageous man with uncommon courage who did us all a big favor. And so I began a process of lobbying the city and the federal government to recognize Gouzenko's bravery and unveil historic plaques in the park so that future generations of visitors would know what happened here. And the resistance that Gouzenko encountered, I got a good taste of that too. Because even though the mayor initially said, oh, this is a good idea, and before the end of the year 2000, we will unveil a plaque in Dundonald Park, the mayor resigned, there was city amalgamation, and the bureaucrats postponed it. Now, what happens in Ottawa when bureaucrats postpone things? No need to answer. The following year, I was told the project was dead because the mayor didn't have the authority to make the commitment, and even if he did, he didn't follow the right process. And it was obvious to me when talking to the bureaucrats of the city that there was profound discomfort with Gouzenko and Stalin and espionage and so on. But I made enough of a fuss that the city clerk said, okay, we're going to recommence the approval process, and the first step is to consult with the federal government. So the city consulted with Foreign Affairs. And Foreign Affairs responded to the city by saying, don't put up a plaque for Gouzenko anywhere, because it's going to upset the Russians. So I got a letter from the city clerk saying, your project is dead because the federal government doesn't want it. Now imagine the absurdity of this situation. In the 1990s, the Soviet archives were open to researchers, historians, and even human rights organizations like Memorial that were publishing on a regular basis the location of mass murders, which took place during the Stalinist purges, and the locations of the mass graves where the evidence was buried. And the Russian people were coming to terms with the truth of their history and what the Kremlin had done to their ancestors and other fellow Russians. On top of it all, one has to consider, I think, that in 1989, when Kim Philby died in Moscow, he was given a full state funeral, full honors for a hero of the Soviet Union. And I don't think anybody in the Soviet government contacted the British ambassador and asked, would you mind if we had a party for the greatest British traitor of the 20th century? Contrast that now to how Gouzenko was treated when he passed away in 1982. He was buried in a secret location in an unmarked grave, like a homeless pauper, which I thought was shameful. There was no public opportunity for Canada to say thank you. But the absurdity continued. Because 1 month after I got a letter from the city clerk saying it's dead because the federal government doesn't want it, the organization at the federal level that I had applied to, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, after 3 years, finally made a positive recommendation to Heritage Minister Sheila Copps. And Sheila Copps announced that she had formally, officially, declared the Gouzenko defection of 1945 as constituting a significant event in Canadian history, and she committed Heritage Canada to unveiling a plaque in Dundonald Park. So this was reported in the media the next day. And I immediately sent an email to the city clerk with a link to the article in the National Post saying, what do you mean the federal government doesn't want it? The federal government's doing it. Well, of course, the city clerk had egg all over his face. And he said, okay, we're going to review the file. Now this was about the fourth or the fifth time that they were reviewing the file. How many times you have to review the file? But fortunately, the city unveiled a plaque in Bandaro Park in 2003, and in 2004, the federal government unveiled its plaque right next to it, directly across from 511 Somerset. It gives me great pleasure every time I go by and see the plaques to think that Igor Gouzenko was finally given the honor and respect that his legacy deserved. When I found out that the NKVD murdered my grandfather, I thought anybody who gives the NKVD a hard time is a hero. And nobody was a bigger hero for me than Igor Gouzenko. So it was a great pleasure to have these plaques finally after 5 years of lobbying. But the 5 years of lobbying that I spent was nothing compared to the 17 years that the Tribute to Liberty organization had to take to get the Victims of Communism monument. And so I think that the people, the leadership of the Victims of the Tribute to Liberty organization are entirely deserving of all the admiration and respect for their persistence, their patience, and their ultimate success in getting those plaques, or the monument, excuse me. Now, when I talk to people about the Katyn massacre, not Polish people, but other nationalities, the most common response is, why? Why would Stalin do such a thing? Well, we have the March 5th, 1940 memo from Beria to the Politburo, in which he indicated that the Poles in captivity were all anti-Soviet, and he recommended that they all be shot. But if being anti-Soviet was the only criterion that justified execution, the Soviets would have had to kill a lot more Polish soldiers and Polish civilians. So what is it about the officers that made them so deserving of murder in the spring of 1940? Well, the standard historical interpretation is that Stalin wanted to decapitate Polish society, get rid of the intelligentsia, so that it would be easier to control Polish society without annoying nuisances and rebellions and so on. So how did that work out? Well, in a nutshell, it didn't. Because at the same time that the Soviets were murdering the intelligentsia at Katyn, the Nazis were engaged in the simultaneous Action AB campaign to similarly get rid of the intelligentsia in the Nazi-occupied zone of Poland. And despite both of their efforts, new leaders emerged in Polish society, and Poland had the largest underground home army in all of occupied Europe. And that Polish yearning for independence and freedom was on full display in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. And despite decades of subsequent Polish or Soviet propaganda and suppression, new leaders emerged across Polish society, in the trade unions, and even in the Vatican. And ultimately, solidarity was one of the key components that contributed to the ultimate collapse of the post-Soviet empire. And that Polish yearning for independence and freedom, I think we know is so deeply intertwined with Polish history that in some cases we may say it's a genetic component of our DNA, and it's passed through blood from generation to generation. And every once in a while, I think that Polish yearning for independence and freedom flares up and manifests itself in the most unexpected places and times. And I'd like to conclude, I think we will within the 20 minutes. And I'll conclude by just giving you one example. And it happens to be the Polish connection to the Gouzenko defection. And more specifically, Svetlana Gouzenko's Polish Polish heritage. Igor Gouzenko said that the defection would not have been successful had it not been for Svetlana. Because at the beginning of his efforts, when the doors kept slamming in his face and he was on the verge of panic, it was Svetlana Gouzenko who provided him with the courage and the confidence to pursue the knocking on doors until he was finally, a door opened and let him in. Now, Svetlana Gouzenko was born after the Russian Revolution, and she grew up in the Soviet education system. So her knowledge of the partitions and Soviet or Russian occupation of Poland during the 19th century was sort of iffy. But in 1960, she wrote her memoirs, Before Igor, My Memories of a Soviet Youth. And in it, she begins by discussing her family background. One chapter is about her father's family, and another chapter is about her mother's. And I'd like to read just 2 short paragraphs to you that I think you might find as heartwarming as I did when I first read them. I know very little of my mother's family's history. Everything was covered by a veil of secrecy. As a child, I was not trusted with secrets that, if carelessly told, might bring misfortune upon us all. It was not until I was well into my teens that I learned some of the details of my mother's background. They were revealed to me by Aunt Natasha, my mother's sister. We all had heard of Aunt Natasha's trunk, but none of us had ever seen it. One day, when we were old enough to be trusted, Aunt Natasha dragged out the trunk. It was a great wrought iron box full of documents, papers, miniature portraits, old currency, and other souvenirs. During the stormy days of the Revolution, the trunk had been buried in an underground hiding place, especially constructed to keep out moisture and mice. Remember, Aunt Natasha whispered as she lifted the lid, words are silver, silence is gold. After long years of solemn preparation, I expected some extraordinary discoveries. But I was disappointed when Aunt Natasha showed me the contents of her famous trunk. Among the carefully kept papers was a personal letter from her great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. She told me he was a man of lofty ideals, that he fought for the independence of Poland and her liberation from Russia. I had never come across his name in my study of European history. I was inclined to think that Aunt Natasha exaggerated his importance. Unfortunately, I did not pay much attention to what she was saying. So, who was Svetlana Gouzenko's great-great-grandfather? None other than Tadeusz Kościuszko.